Welcome to Appointed.
Uh, Thank you very much, as always, Nicola, for setting us all up. And I'm incredibly pleased to be joined on Appointed today by Theresa Donkor. Theresa is a criminal defense lawyer and advocate. She's not just a criminal defense, she is a phenomenal criminal defense lawyer and advocate, and someone who, if I could have her work for every single person, like the guy who I was just talking to before this phone call, I would have her doing that. But of course, she's one person, not cloned 500 times. But she offers all kinds of incredible expert testimony, as well as very practical advice when she's called before our parliamentary committees. She has very much understands the intersections between class, race, ability, and the legal system. And so it's not surprising that she's the Advocacy Director for the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, that she has worked on many of these issues for many years, even though she's very young, that she's often provided testimony before various House of Commons as well as Senate committees. And a recent example is evidence she provided regarding what many of us have called performative amendments into the criminal code, ostensibly there to try and deal with car theft, but then stuck in the Budget Implementation Act, and which is from my perspective, evidence that the government needed to get it through and didn't really want a lot of discussion, but we ensured that we had a fulsome view of it. One of the things that I'm working on, and one of the things that, the work that many of us have done for decades in this area have revealed is that intersection of course, race and but also class, in terms of who has access to the resources that allow you to experience any uh, reasonable facsimile even of fairness, equality, justice. And so that's really what led me to focus on things like a guaranteed livable basic income. And we have a bill before Parliament now. It's actually before the Finance Committee in the Senate. There's a similar bill, in fact, the exact same wording, just it's actually introduced by First Nations leader and member of Parliament, Leah Gazan, who is a Lakota from and lives in Treaty 1 territory, otherwise known as Winnipeg. And we have introduced it in large part because of these issues. So one of the things we wanted to talk to, because of your incredible expertise and experience, is talk to folks like you about how the implementation of a guaranteed livable basic income might actually address a variety of issues, including Indigenous rights, rights to self-determination, gender, sexual-based violence, stigma, and as well, something that we've often talked about and that you are very familiar with, the mass incarceration, in particular, of Indigenous and Black peoples in Canada. So to start off, Theresa, Ms Donkor, sorry, I don't mean no disrespect by calling you by your first name, but please call me Kim. To begin, if you can speak about your experience as a criminal defense lawyer and the impact and the intersections of poverty and criminalization, and how you see that playing out, and how this relates to the work you're doing and what you might see moving ahead. So uh, I know enough to now get out of the way because you will share incredible insight and expertise with us. So over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me and thank you for the warm welcome. You can absolutely call me Teresa. The only people that are I know as Miss Donkor is my mom, so feel free to call me Teresa. Um, when we think about, the intersection between poverty and criminalization, in my own experience, most of my clients are low income and racialized folks. And I think there's a number of contributing factors to that. For starters, we know that there is a causal connection between socioeconomic factors and crime. We know that offending behavior can be driven by factors like lack of educational opportunities, poverty, mental health and addiction issues, and even systemic discrimination. So those are all things that constrain a person's actions and behaviors. But we also know, on the other hand, that low income and racialized communities are disproportionately policed. This is something that even the Supreme Court of Canada acknowledged in a case called Lee. So I would say that poverty and criminalization are intricately tied together. In my experience, many people who come in contact with our criminal legal system are not bad people. They're not violent people. They're not dangerous people. A lot of the time, it's their personal circumstances that lead them to be before the courts. Their socioeconomic circumstances are often the root causes of offending behavior. And I would say that in terms of the impact that has, it kind of has a compounding effect because if it's their socioeconomic circumstances that lead them to get caught up in the criminal legal system, it's often those same factors that make it very difficult for them to get out of the system. So, for example, with our bail system, if you don't have a suitable surety who can pledge money for bail, or if you don't have adequate housing, those are things that can lead you to being denied bail and having to remain in custody as you await your trial. And that's before you've even been found guilty of anything. That's with the presumption of innocence. That's before a conviction. But that time that you spend in custody awaiting trial can lead to you losing your job, losing your apartment, all of these things that cause even further financial hardship. And so, unfortunately, the relationship is compounding, but it's also cyclical. It becomes a cycle that's very difficult to break. And I think that that's one of the main issues with our criminal legal system as it is right now.
Hmm. Well, and another thing that the next stage of that, as you know, is that if they come out with a criminal record, then the chances of getting another job, of getting an apartment, of all of the things that that go along with the baggage that comes with that, is many people describe that they go into prison and they come out with even more challenges than they went in. And given what you've identified so clearly, that so many of them, it's basically, I often say the prisons are full of the people who every other system has failed. And very rarely do you have someone who is the stereotype that many people think of, who go out, commit a predatory act of violence, without anything happening beforehand. In most cases, people are reacting to their circumstances either to try and to survive poverty, violence, past trauma, um, you know, everything from, as we've documented in the 12 Indigenous Women report, everything from residential school to child welfare involvement and beyond. And so, um, in that report, in the 12 Indigenous Women report, we talk about the experiences and circumstances faced by 12 women who I know well. It's not only those 12 Indigenous women this applies to, though, but these were 12 women who were meeting with Justice Juanita Westmoreland Traore and Justice Harry Laforme when they were looking at the whole issue of the need for conviction reviews in this country. And they were the ones that really encouraged we write up their situations. And they are emblematic of so many people I know in the system, where we see the intersections of class, race, sex, ability, past experiences of abuse and trauma, the leading to their criminalization, in fact, making their criminalization almost inevitable. And 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 also a decided lack of fairness, justice, ability to experience anything but a criminal legal system that quickly criminalizes them and incarcerates them. So I'm curious as to, in the ways you've seen how these intersections, and in particular with poverty, perpetuate and exacerbate systemic racism. Because you're dealing with folks, as you mentioned, coming in who are charged, who are, you're trying to get out on judicial interim release or bail, as we often talk about it. You're then trying to work on sentencing, who then are, trying to integrate into the community afterwards, and that vicious cycle that happens that you refer to. Um, so, how do you think sufficient funds to access basic needs might lower the crime rate? In fact, in particular, in or for racialized communities.
So I think you asked me two questions there. I'll address the first question is about how, poverty can perpetuate systemic racism, because I think that's something that we see regularly in our criminal legal system. Certainly, poverty reinforces negative and even racist stereotypes. So, you know, we know that it's low income and racialized folks that are before the courts again and again. And that creates a tendency for people to think that those kind of people are untrustworthy or dangerous or irresponsible. And I've already explained why all those things are not inherently true. But those negative stereotypes are reinforced in our social institutions, which lead to systemic racism. So, an example of this that we see is, a low income racialized person comes before the courts due to their personal circumstances. They're convicted of even a very minor offense. And then, as you said, because of their criminal record, they're unable to, get employment or, get housing. And that's because of the negative stereotypes that are somewhat ingrained in us as a society. It's because of the systemic racism that we see in our social institutions. So they start off with a place of disadvantage, and then they get caught up in this legal system that disadvantages them even more. And then because of the way that our structures are set up, because of the systemic discrimination that's so ingrained in these structures, it just perpetuates the cycle and it perpetuates the systemic discrimination and racism. I think we also see it throughout the legal system, throughout, a criminal proceeding. We see it even with juries. Racist stereotypes lead us to trust and more likely acquit a white person who has the means to hire two lawyers more than a black self-represented defendant who, even if they are charged with exactly the same offense and exactly the same set of facts or allegations. It is the systemic discrimination and negative racial stereotypes that lead us to trust one defendant more than the other, which leads to better acquittal rates for one defendant more than the other. So I think poverty really just limits access to opportunities and resources. And if you are racialized, that lack of opportunities and resources is often used against you in our social structures. And to answer your second question, how, how might sufficient funds lower the crime rates, particularly in racialized communities? I always say that, if we want to make our communities safer, we have to start addressing the root determinants of crime. And we know there's data out there that shows that poverty is a very significant determinant of crime. So not only would, access to basic income address what I would call crimes of survival, like such as, stealing for food, but it'll also alleviate constraints and choices which make which lead to offending behavior. Ultimately, I think that it's not going to be an annual increase in police budget that makes our community safer. We've seen it time and time again. The police budget is increased every year, and crime rates aren't going down. Uh, I think what it's really going to take is meaningful investment in things like safe housing, things like mental health and addiction services, education, and things like guaranteed livable income.
Right. Yeah. That sometimes we're looking for more complex answers than we actually need. I just had this discussion with the gentleman I was on the phone with, but also with Indigenous community last week when I was out west, and they were very clear. They said we would have fewer people going to prison from our communities if we had the housing, if we had the supports, if we had the way for them to actually their term was self-actualized, to actually be able to explore their artistic talents, explore their cultural interests, explore the issues, instead of sitting around looking, supposedly looking for non-existent jobs in their communities and sitting on social assistance, which of course we know keeps people not just stuck, but ensnared in poverty. And so really, yeah, it's not like people don't need other supports, of course, and that the impacts in the intersection of racism and other forms of discriminatory attitudes don't impact. But sometimes ignoring what we could be doing that could alleviate this is really quite obvious. And so I'm curious as well, in addition to how you might see a guaranteed livable basic income might assist your clients, what other areas and what other issues do you think we should be taking on in order to address the systemic discrimination and stem the mass incarceration, in particular of those of African and Caribbean descent, Black Canadians in the criminal, legal, and prison systems?
That's almost a loaded question because there's so much that can be done, and I know that there's not one thing that's going to fix the problem. There's not one thing that's going to fix the mass incarceration of Black folks and systemic racism. There's certainly a lot of ideas that I can think of. Obviously, we're going to need, you know, in my opinion, a mass overhaul of the criminal legal system. We need criminal justice reform. We need less reliance on the court system and more reliance on things like restorative justice programs. We're going to need decriminalization of minor offenses. We're going to need, as I said, greater investment in social services. Really, the list goes on. But again, I know that it's not going to be one of those things that fixes the problem. It's really just incremental steps. And I do think that every small step that we can take forward towards that goal matters. But again, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of commitment to it. And, probably a lot of money. But if it's something that our society cares about, we see money goes to the things that we care about. So if this is something that our society cares about, that our communities care about, then it's time to start investing in those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's very real. And, and another issue, and I was just having this conversation with the man who called, and he, he said, how come we never question what we're spending on jails? And this was a young man, a young Black man from the East Coast who was in the child welfare system, ended up in custody as a 16-year-old, transferred into the adult system, and is now trying to still extricate himself, even though he has a career. He's actually become a professional boxer. He's doing really well. And yet at every step, he's being pulled back, even just now trying to just spend time with his loved ones, as one of his relatives is quite ill and is not being permitted to, here's someone who, by all external standards, including the criminal legal system standards, has succeeded, has come through, is supporting himself, and he's still being pulled back. And so, I think that the issues that you're highlighting are really important, and the fact that we need to really take these on incrementally, but also making those links, but also, I think, challenging folks to really pay attention to what we already spend. We spend over $80 billion a year keeping people in poverty through our social assistance schemes. We spend tens of billions of dollars a year keeping people incarcerated, only to come out often with the very same challenges and more when they exit prison. And, often we don't challenge the people who are voting in the various members of parliament and governments to think about how do they want those resources redirected for the benefit of all of us. And certainly if we invested even a fraction of the money that gets invested in the criminal legal system now into community-based options, we know they would increase the likelihood of people having success. And a good example is what the government did do in 2015 in the youth system, and started focusing on how do we actually build resources in the community, and how do we demand that judges consider those options. That decision alone changed the number of young people being kept in custody. And it also revealed the racism of the system, because as you will know, and as this young man who was calling revealed, it was mostly Indigenous and Black kids left in the system. So it then allows us to, at the very least, open that up and say, okay, what do we do next to address this issue, and not pretend not put our heads in the sand and pretend that there aren't things we can do. And you do this every day. I don't need to tell you. And you're every day in the courts, every day advocating. The fact that you come often with very short notice to assist us, the politicians who are looking at this, is is a testament to the incredible value of the work you're doing and the leadership you're demonstrating. So I want to thank you, Theresa, for all of the work you do every day, and I hope that you are recognized for that work. Not, and I know you're not one who's looking for that kind of recognition, but because of the work you're doing to try and alleviate these very issues for so many, and for folks who don't otherwise have the voice that too many of us ignore in the community. So I want to thank you for that, and express my incredible admiration for the inspirational work you do every day.
Well, thank you. I think for me, it is deeply personal as a Black person myself. It's my own community that's being under attack. It's people who look like me, people who look like my family, people who look like my ancestors. So it's deeply personal work for me. And yeah, for me, I don't need the recognition. I think what I get, my joy from is from, I think on a macro level, it can feel very discouraging to see that, you try and you try and try and very little work is being done. But on a micro level, with the individual clients that I interact with every single day, if I can make some sort of impact, meaningful impact on their lives, that's worth it to me. So I'm grateful to be in this profession. I'm grateful to be doing the work, and hopefully we can do some more advocacy to see some meaningful change.
Absolutely. So thank you for that, and thank you for continuing on and for leading in this way.
Thank you.
So one of the other things, are there other ways that a guaranteed livable income could assist your clients? And can you talk also about the particular impact of poverty and the lack of income on Canadians of Black and Caribbean descent, Black Canadians, and the Black folks you work with?
Yeah, of course. Those are two, I think, very important questions. I think when we think about Black Canadians, I know you've done a lot of work with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people in Canada. And while they have a very distinct history, I think a lot of the same effects of discrimination and marginalization that they face are similar to what Black communities face in Canada. On the one hand, we have this history of slavery and racism and the trauma of marginalization and injustice that Black communities are confronted with. And then on the other hand, we have, present day discrimination that we face. And part of that I think is a lot of the negative racial stereotypes about Black people and the criminal legal system. We see this all the time on social media. We see this in the comments in news. People will say, "Well, if they didn't commit so many crimes, then there wouldn't be so many of them in prison." And that statement, it really irks me because it's really just premised on, quite frankly, a racist idea that Black people are inherently more criminal. And there's just so much data out there that disproves that. What the data really shows is that the circumstances of Black people can create an increased likelihood of engagement in the criminal legal system. So, for example, Black children are more likely to be investigated by children's aid societies. Black students are more harshly disciplined in schools. In the employment sector, Black people face hiring discrimination that leads to higher unemployment levels. And as I've already said, low income and racialized communities are disproportionately policed. And this over-policing corresponds with the frequency in which Black people are convicted and incarcerated. So all of those examples are examples of socioeconomic disadvantages and systemic discrimination at play. Those are not factors that show that your Blackness makes you more likely to be a criminal. So that's certainly something that, the work that I'm doing in my practice and also the work that CABL is doing is hoping to advocate against and address. And in terms of how else guaranteed livable basic income might assist my clients. I think one thing that's often not talked about, but I know that you, Kim, and your team have addressed this before, and I think it's very important to raise awareness to this, is this idea of the cognitive tax of scarcity, which is essentially the idea that a shortage of money causes you to neglect other things in your life. And when we think about that in the criminal law context, particularly in sentencing, we're often focused on denunciation, deterrence, and rehabilitation. The balancing of deterring future crimes, denouncing and holding folks accountable for their offenses, and considering their rehabilitative prospects. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that and a person won't even have the mental capacity to think about accountability if they don't know where their next meal is going to come from, if they don't know where they're going to lay their head at night. So having this basic income security would assist with accountability and rehabilitation, which are, two of our tenets of sentencing, two of our tenets of what we see as crime and punishment. So those are things to really keep in mind. I think that uh, guaranteed livable basic income goes beyond just, um, supporting individuals and lowering poverty rates. It goes beyond what we typically think of when we think about livable income. And people think about, well, it's going to make people lazier, it's going to make people, um, work less. But when we really think about it in the context of criminal law, it can have a profound impact on, you know, the rates of crime, both in entering the criminal legal system and exiting the criminal legal system. So I think that's a really important factor to keep in mind about how this can really have a meaningful impact.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and something that Dr. Zhao, who's done a bunch of the research in this area, she's a professor at UBC who has is also involved in cash transfers and with homeless people in Vancouver. And what she's found exactly that she's been able to track as a psychologist, as a researcher, that you can actually see the decrease in the capacity to think and plan that you've talked about in people. And the other thing she has really, I think, put really challenged people's thinking about is the presumption, not just that people won't work or that somehow it's a choice, but she showed that in fact your ability to actually make choices, even if there are some opportunities that are there, becomes really limited. But also that once you have some of those basic needs met, people make choices very differently. And she's tracked that even amongst people who have addictions, that spending on drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes, for instance, decreases for everybody when they have when they're they have greater economic security, which is flies in the face of many of the discriminatory attitudes and stereotypes people have about it. So thank you for raising that. That is a very key point, and obviously will impact a lot, could positively impact a lot of people.